Hey, my name is Rowan Smith and I want to welcome you to the Training for Trekking podcast. Now, this is the world's very first podcast which is entirely dedicated to helping you train, prepare and conquer your upcoming hike, trek or mountain adventure. So once a week, I'm going to be giving you quality and practical information on the subjects of physical preparation for trekking, dealing with altitude and nutrition on the trail, so you can know everything you need to be doing to have the best chance of a safe, enjoyable and successful adventure. So now you know what you're in for. Let's get into today's episode. Right, hello, ladies and gentlemen. So today we are talking all about fatigue and injury prevention for hikers, and specifically why we want to consider our fitness and minimize our levels of fatigue when we're looking through the context and the perception of, reducing the risk of common injuries on the trail. So, as we know, in the world of hiking, injuries, they do happen. Things like sprained ankles, things like twisted knees, things like throwing your back out, things like hurting your foot or pulling a muscle or having a slip, stumble or fall and hurt yourself there. There's all these different things that commonly happen on the trail. And when we're looking at our training, one of the big factors why we train and why I recommend hikers train is you can do a lot to help reduce the risk of certain types of injuries. Now, there's nothing you can do to completely eliminate the chance of that. Injury prevention, as an absolute, is just 100% not possible. But there are certain things we can do to reduce the risk of injury. And we often talk about things like strength training and maybe a bit of mobility and maybe certain hiking techniques or whatever it may be. And all of those do have their place. But today I want to talk about fatigue specifically and how that sort of plays into this particular role. So when it comes down to it, fatigue and exhaustion are significant risk factors when it comes to the risk of injury on the trail. So I'll say that again. Fatigue and exhaustion are significant risk factors when it comes to the risk of injury while you're on the trail. Because, when we are out on the trail, and we do start to get a bit fatigued. We start to get tired. We start to drag our feet. We start to not have that pep in our step. And we're like, you know what? I'm feeling it. We've all been there. There are certain things that happen in the body beyond us just being tired, but certain specific things that happen in our body which can affect our risk of injury. Now, for one, when we start to get fatigued, what will often happen is we'll start to have what's known as lower foot clearance. Now, what that means is every single time we take a step, our feet have to lift off the ground, rotate around, step in front of us, and then go through your walking gait. Then the other foot lifts off the ground, rotates around, and steps in front of us. And essentially, when we're walking, there's always a certain distance that, we typically will go from with that foot from the floor into the air and how high it is when we're walking around. Now, that's absolutely fine. That's normal. Everyone has sort of certain heights, whatever it may be. And when we're walking on the flat, it doesn't really matter. But as we start to get fatigued, what typically happens is the muscles get a little bit sore as we begin to compensate. Muscles get tired, I should say. We begin to compensate. The distance between the foot and the ground, as we're sort of swinging around and as we're taking our step, it gets a little bit lower, meaning we don't lift our leg up quite as high. And this is only a minuscule change. It's only tiny, tiny, tiny. But it can be pretty significant on the trail because day to day we're walking around the flat. Worst case scenario, what's going to happen? You might sort of, step on a crack or step on a rock or something like that. It's not that big a deal. We can kind of get through flat walking fine, regardless of where our foot clearance is most of the time. But on the trail, obviously, we're not dealing with flat walking. We're dealing with pebbles. We're dealing with rocks. We're dealing with potholes. We're dealing with slidey things. We're dealing with all these bits and pieces. So when that foot clearance begins to get a little bit lower, when we are fatigued, and that minuscule change happens, that actually is pretty significant. Because then there's less likelihood of us sort of getting our feet over these rocks. There's more likelihood of us stubbing our toes, catching our feet, catching bits and pieces. And that can significantly increase the risk of us having a slip, a stumble, a fall, or whatever it may be, which can lead to various injuries. So that's number one. When we're fatigued, we experience lower foot clearance. Number two is when we are fatigued, we experience reduced mental clarity, alertness, and reduced decision making. So what that means is as we're getting tired, and we have all gone through this, we all know this, but just to put it into words, as we get tired, we don't really start to think quite as clearly. We can't concentrate. We start to wander with our mind. We start to daydream. We're not really paying attention to what's going on. And, on the trail, again, this can be impactful because we're not just walking along the street. We're not just walking along the flat, but all these different things coming up. So there's rocks, there's potholes, there's slippery sections, there's, things you have to, deal with. There's sort of turns you have to make. You have to read a map and all of that stuff. There's all these bits and pieces that, obviously mental clarity and alertness plays very significantly into it. On top of that is decision making. When we're fatigued, our decision making skills go down a little bit. So maybe when we're going down a steep descent, maybe we won't choose the safest or the most effective route. Maybe when we're looking at certain trails, we may not actually sort of choose the best way of getting through sections. Maybe when we're sort of looking at something that's a bit dodgy, maybe our perception of risk gets all out of whack or whatever it may be. It can play up in a whole bunch of different ways. But essentially, fatigue can lead to less effective decision making. Now, number 3, when we're fatigued, we can experience reduced reaction time. Meaning, if you do have a slip, if you do step on a dodgy rock, if you do slip on some moss or some mud or some snow, whatever it may be, we all go through this period where, or this situation where we feel it slips, and then we try to catch ourselves. We feel our foot sliding out from us, and we try to catch ourselves before something goes wrong. Or alternatively, maybe something's really wrong. And we have to sort of quickly, we have to sort of, grab a tree to stop us falling off a cliff. Worst case scenario. Hopefully never go through that. But you know what I mean. There's all these little things that we try to, that happens. We need to react quickly on the trail to save ourselves from turning into something that turns into worse. And when we're fatigued, we experience reduced reaction time, which can play into this. And then finally, when we are fatigued, our balance and our stability does get affected. We get jelly legs. We aren't sort of balancing. We aren't feeling like our legs are supporting us as well as can be. There's all these different things that can play into balance and stability on the trail. And when we're fatigued, that goes down as well. So all in all, fatigue can basically increase the likelihood of slips, stumbles, and falls. And it can lower the chance of us actually catching ourselves or correcting issues if something does go wrong on the trail. So when we are looking at the perspective or through the lens of injury prevention, yes, strength training is important. Yes, load management is important. Yes, all these other bits and pieces that we talk about on this podcast are important. But we cannot forget about reducing the risk of reducing fatigue on the trail because it plays into so much. So essentially, what I'm trying to get through to you today is if you're the type of hiker who goes on hikes regularly and you get through them, but throughout the whole hike, you feel like, what? I am at the limit. This is a challenge. I'm huffing and puffing. I'm struggling. I'm dragging my feet. And at the end of the trail, more often than not, you are really, really tired and you're cooked. That is probably a sign that you want to work on your fitness. And not only work on your fitness to be able to enjoy yourself and to be able to get through these things and keep up with people and tackle more challenging trails, but also on the fact when we're looking through this perspective of injury prevention, you want to make sure you're not getting to that fatigued, exhausted state on the trail because it can significantly affect your risk of injury. So something very much to consider. And also when you're considering more challenging hikes as well that you're stepping into. Yes, you can scrape yourself through anything, but if you want to do it right, not right, right's the wrong word, but if you want to do it in the best way possible, you should always be aiming to get your fitness to a level where you're almost more fit than you need to be for the particular hiking you want to be doing. And that is where your training does come in. And that is what you want to be thinking about through your week. So essentially, when you are looking at fatigue, I'm not going to go into these things in detail because we talk about this a million times in the podcast. But just give you a rundown. 4 things or 5 things you should be thinking about to reduce your risk of fatigue. Number 1, training. Take your training seriously. Put the effort into your week. Work on the sessions we recommend in this podcast. Be consistent with it, and it will go a long, long way. Make sure you're top on your fueling. So make sure you are eating enough of the right types of foods before and during your hikes. Don't just underpack your foods, just to get yourself hungry on the trail the whole time. Make sure you are taking your fueling seriously. Stay on top of your pacing. Try to work at a pace that is going to be sustainable for you. Try not to get, dragged out to really quick paces that get you knackered. Look after that. Make sure you are resting and not just sort of pushing yourself through. And I often recommend resting before you feel like you really, really need it. And that can go a long way. And then also finally, just choosing tracks and trails, which is a slow ramp up. That isn't always stretching you to the limit, but slowly working through things that you are comfortable with. All of those things go into fatigue management, and all of those things are worth considering. Again, I'm not going to go into them in detail today because we talked about in this podcast a million times. But basically what I want to say is if you are concerned about injury prevention, if you are, worried about the risk of slips, stumbles, or falls, if you have had previous injuries on the trail and you just don't want it to happen again, there are so many things you want to be working on, yes, to help with that, and so many things that can be beneficial. But absolutely never forget fatigue management is going to be a big part of that. Now, if you were listening to this and you're like, you know what, Rom, I like what you're saying. That makes sense. I hate the thought of injury getting in the way of my hiking. I feel like I'm always at the limit of my hiking, or I feel like there's certain areas of my hiking that I need to improve on to be a bit more comfortable and be more confident with it all. If you're thinking that and you want some help with that, I would absolutely love to chat with you. Now, if you want to find out a little bit more about how I help hikers all around the world get fit, strong, resilient for your adventures, you can go to the page summitstrength.com.au/online, and I'll leave a link for that in the show notes below. Now, on that particular page, I'll talk you through, it has some information around how my programs work, what it's all about, how I help hikers, and there's a little bit of a contact form below where you can reach out and we can have a bit of a chat. So if you were interested in minimizing fatigue, in reducing the risk of injury, of just generally getting fit, strong, in a really good spot for your adventures, I would absolutely love to chat with you. So please don't hesitate. Check out the page. If it sounds something you'd like, you can reach out to me and we can have a chat. So thank you so much for listening today. I really do hope you've enjoyed this episode. Hope you got a bit out of it, and we'll talk to you very, very soon.